Good afternoon, and welcome to the Sustainable Cleveland 2021 Virtual Summit. We would like to thank our host for the summit, the Cleveland Public Library. My name is Kathy Len, Sustainable Cleveland Manager, and you've joined the Prevalence of Plastics in Our Waters breakout session. Our moderator for this session is Jill Bartolotta. Jill is an extension educator with Ohio Sea Grant. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Kathy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Plastics in Our Waters session. We have three great speakers for everyone today to address plastics in our waters. I am going to start off this session. I'm just going to give a quick intro to plastics, why they're an issue, and how they actually get into our waters. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So hopefully everybody can hear me and see my screen. And so really quickly, like I said, I just want to introduce this topic of plastics in our water. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen in the media or heard about plastics in the ocean. However, plastics are just as much of an issue in our freshwater bodies, such as rivers, inland lakes, the Great Lakes, ponds, stuff like that. So we're going to be focusing today on freshwater environments and then water that is associated with this area for us here in the Great Lakes. So plastics get into water mostly from our activities on the land. So this would be things like just everyday living. So driving, walking around, recreating on the beach. Sometimes we accidentally litter without knowing it. Sometimes people intentionally litter. I don't know if any of you have ever seen trash cans that are overflowing, or if you've ever driven behind a waste management truck and there's trash flying off of it. That's how trash gets on the land. And then when we get big rain events or we get big wind events, that trash eventually makes its way into a nearby river. Maybe it makes its way into a storm drain, and then storm drains, they connect directly to rivers and lakes. And so that's a big conduit for trash getting into our rivers and Lake Erie. There are some in-water activities that contribute to the plastics issue. Commercial fishing for us here in Lake Erie is not so much of an issue, but we do see it in the other Great Lakes. We do have just recreational fishing that can contribute nets and fishing line. Also transportation. Again, transportation with large freighters on the Great Lakes is not so much of an issue. That's more of an ocean issue. But we have had instances, for example, where something like a train has tipped over and there's been plastic particles on that train, and those have gotten into the water. When we look at commonly found items, we're going to see that 96% of these items are plastic. They're usually going to be single-use plastics, meaning that these are plastics that are created to be used once and then thrown away. When we do beach cleanups, we find a lot of cigarette butts. The filter in a cigarette butt is actually plastic fibers. And then we find other commonly used plastics like bottle caps, straws, utensils, bags, food wrappers, and then plastic bottles. These plastics eventually break down into smaller plastics, which we call microplastics, and that can lead to a whole slew of issues, which I'll address here in a couple slides. And just for us here in the Great Lakes, we're seeing about 22 million pounds of plastic will enter the Great Lakes each year. And the reason plastic is not a good thing when it gets in the natural environment is it affects all of the living organisms in that environment. So with COVID, we've seen a huge influx in the amount of medical waste. And so like masks, we're starting to see animals entangled in masks. Also plastic garden mesh, that's the plastic mesh that's put down when people are trying to plant grass. We're seeing that entangling snakes. Also, if you look to that picture on the bottom right, I mean, it just doesn't look nice. And that affects tourism and beach activities in our area. And then also it's being ingested by animals. So the smallest animals on this planet are called zooplankton, and they live in fresh and salt water. They're actually ingesting these plastic pieces, and we're seeing this move up the food web, and we're seeing plastic being found in our smallest animals, and then also, you know, some of the largest animals on this planet, like whales and stuff like that. Also, what we're going to be really focusing on today is plastic in our water, and we have a great presentation about plastic in tap versus bottled water. Plastic is found in both tap and bottled water. Bottled water has 2 times more plastics, and they think that's mostly because of the process of putting a cap on a bottle. It releases plastics from that cap into that bottle of water. And if you do a search on Google, there's a lot of research being done by the medical community, by environmental researchers, chemists, biologists that are addressing the issue of plastics and the chemicals associated with plastics and how they affect living organisms. And what they're finding is that plastics, they're not good for us. They provide us no nutritional value, and they can lead to a whole slew of issues. They can affect the hormones in our body. They can affect how we think, how we reproduce, and how we function. And so it's really important that we learn more about plastics, but we also learn how we can move away from our use and our misuse of plastics. All right, and if anyone has any questions, this is just some information on how to get in touch with me. And if you're interested in learning more about the Sea Grant program, here's our information as well. But now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tim Hoellein. He is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Loyola University of Chicago. And today he is going to be talking about the spatial and temporal patterns of plastic litter in freshwater. So.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we're still getting some feedback, Tim, but it's not too bad.
Okay. In the meantime, while you're talking, I found a headset from a neighbor, so I was hoping that did it.
Can you still start? I'm going to mute myself. I probably will.
All right. So do I just let you know to advance the slides? Okay. All right, I'll go ahead here. Thanks for having me. Thanks for your interest in this topic. I'm excited to share some of our research. This picture is not our research. This is a cobra that's bitten a python. And so while the python is dying of the venom, while the python is dying of the venom from the cobra has strangled the python has strangled the cobra to death. This is a picture I saw online I thought was really amazing, but if you advance one slide, this is the actual picture. And so while many people were commenting on the snakes, I was also observing that there was a lot of trash in the background. And I think this is indicative of the idea that we've come to accept nature as occurring on a field of human development and human impact, which includes trash. So on the next slide are some colleagues collecting water samples for chemicals, dissolved chemicals in the stream. But on first glance at the stream, it's pretty obvious that there's another problem here with trash. So trash is one of those things that we see so often that we kind of stop seeing. It fades into the background of our vision and can become so commonplace that we stop thinking about it. But it's a global and persistent pollutant everywhere. So the next slide. It's not just urban habitats. This is an uninhabited island in the Pacific Ocean. Nobody lives there, nobody lives close, but it's covered in trash from global ocean currents. Next. And the reason there's more trash out there is because we produce more trash every year than we did the year before. This is an estimate of plastic production between 1950 and 2015. You can see that there's an accelerating rate of production for all kinds of plastic types. You might recognize PVC or PP, polypropylene. All of them are increasing, and so we find more waste. Next. And this plastic has a host of biological interactions. There's entanglement, ingestion, and as Jill was saying, there's chemicals in this plastic that can be released when it's swallowed by animals, and those have all sorts of different physiological impacts. Next. So I'd like to show you a few results from our work around the Great Lakes. basically to show the distribution of trash, how it changes over time, and how we've applied some of that work, hopefully, to make a difference. Next. This is a picture of a beach on Lake Michigan here in Chicago. You probably see this all over the Great Lakes. There's organic matter, naturally occurring leaf litter, grass, algae, that accumulates on what we call a strand line. That's the high watermark from a storm. But it's pretty obvious that there's also trash mixed in with this litter. And when you look at the beach, there's trash everywhere, but we see essentially the most trash associated with these natural organic matter accumulations. So in the next slide, we've quantified this now on a number of beaches, and we find results that look relatively straightforward. Where we find more naturally occurring litter, organic matter, we find more trash or more litter. And this is positively associated across all different beaches and all sorts of different places on our Great Lakes beaches. Next. We've also done the same work in our area rivers. You know, this is the North Branch of the Chicago River. Some places it looks great and free of trash, but in other places, if you click the next slide, there's lots of litter accumulating. And if you click the next slide, we observe that litter accumulates in these naturally occurring debris dams. These are really important ecologically significant habitats in streams. Leaf litter, sediment, sticks accumulate here. It provides food and habitat for bugs and fish. And we observe that trash is also directed towards these accumulation sites. So we've gone to a bunch of rivers, we've picked these debris dams apart, measured litter in other parts of the streams, and found pretty conclusively, next slide, that there is more litter in these natural debris dam accumulations than in other parts of the stream that don't have these kinds of debris dams. And much of that litter is made of plastic. So plastic is in blue, and styrofoam, which is also plastic, in yellow, is a really large proportion of the litter, as Julius mentioned in the previous presentation. So the next slide. We know that litter is unevenly distributed. It's moving according to really kind of natural and predictable processes that move naturally occurring organic matter. But we also know that it's variable. It changes over time. And we've assessed that a few ways. So next slide. We work with the Alliance for the Great Lakes Adopt a Beach program. This is a really great program that's been picking up trash on our beaches for many years. And what's really nice is the volunteers write down what they find. On the next slide, this is a close-up of the data sheet. So they tally what they find as they walk along the beach, and there's lots of information here. We know what the item is, we know what the item is made of, you know, paper or styrofoam, and we have different categories if it's related to food, if it's related to medical waste or fishing. And my students have been assessing this really long data set for a couple of years now. And one thing we've found is on the next slide. It's pretty promising. So this is a figure. This is showing the cigarette butts on Chicago beaches and Milwaukee beaches. And we have this for other cities as well. Cigarette butts are really one of the most common items on our beaches. But because these volunteers have been collecting data for decades, we can actually look back in time to see how those patterns have changed. And we see a consistent decline in cigarette butts on our beaches. Why do we see that? Well, smoking rates have gone down in the U.S. over this period. And the reason that smoking rates have gone down is attributed to really a wide array of policies about lots of different anti-smoking laws, taxes that are applied to cigarettes, public education campaigns. All of those things have kind of changed cultural norms, and they've had a positive public health impact. And we can show, because of the volunteers that are doing this work, we can show that it's also reduced the amount of cigarettes on our beaches. Next slide. Another way we've looked kind of over time is to use museum specimens as kind of a time capsule of pollution. So museums are repositories of all sorts of different specimens, and we've worked with the Field Museum and the fish curator there to examine plastic in the guts of fish that have been collected over a period of about 100 years. So we had a few common fish species for the region. The museum was generous enough to donate their guts to us. We dissect their stomachs. We subject them to a couple of processing steps, and we can count the plastic, the microplastic in the fish guts. So if you look at the next slide, this is a result where we've got microplastic concentrations in all of those fish from a period of 1900 to 2018, and it is increasing. And if you click the next slide, This is the plastic production figure that I showed you. So estimate of plastic production between 1950 and 2015. And the pattern holds. Other people have examined lake sediments, sediments in the ocean, and found the same pattern. And what we can take away from this is, as long as plastic has been produced since mid-century, it's been a feature of our lives, but it's also been a feature of our environment. So if you click the next slide, we can say that microplastic exposure in organisms and in our environment has been ongoing ever since widespread production. And because we expect plastic production to continue to accelerate, we can use this trend to make predictions about what that will look like in the coming decades. So next slide. Yeah, just to conclude here, I think there's mixed messages. Some litter is decreasing, cigarette butts, for example, and I think that's very encouraging. It suggests that litter reduction is possible. Given time, given lots of energy from many different stakeholders, we can see changes. And now that we have other changes ongoing related to plastic bags, straws, microbeads, various other products, I think we could expect reasonably to see a difference in the pollution down the road, as long as we have good data to keep assessing that. But other types of pollution are increasing. Microplastic in particular is very difficult to remove, very difficult to manage, and each piece of large plastic can generate many microplastics that will persist for a long time. All right, next slide is the last section here. I just want to make a point that I'm always really encouraged to work in a collaborative way to take the science and hopefully apply it to change. So in the next slide, there's a couple ways we've done this. We work with some education professors here at Loyola. We've developed modules to think about teaching trash, essentially to students to think about environmental conservation, making predictions, doing fractions, thinking about their own impact on Earth. And if you click, this is a zooming in here. Next slide. Click. The students will make predictions, think about how a bottle gets from somebody's hand into the stomach of a bird or a fish. All right, next slide. We also, of course, work with volunteers, the Alliance for the Great Lakes, Friends of the Chicago River, Shed Aquarium, a whole variety of groups that are mobilizing volunteers to collect data for science and help us understand this issue better. And then finally, the very last one here, next slide. This field really requires so much teamwork across disciplines. It's not just science and education, but anyone really that's interested and has a stake in the outcome is I think, welcome and valued to participate their energy and their skills. So that includes probably a lot of people that attend this conference and others that are in our lives as well. So next slide is the end. I just thanks everyone for all the work.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was really interesting information. I think the work you were doing with the preserved fish and dating it back to, historical ingestion of plastics in fish was very, very interesting. All right, so if anyone has any questions for Tim, you can go ahead and put those in the chat and we will address them at the end. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We will be having Shelly Helsel. She is a chemist with the Cleveland Department of Water. And speakers, just so you know, I have to stop sharing my screen to unmute myself. So if you could, try to keep track of your 10 minutes, that'd be great. Tim, you did a perfect job. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and share my screen and turn it over to Shelly.
Thank you for the introduction. My name's Shelly Helsel. I'm a chemist with Cleveland Water. Next slide. And before we talk about microplastics, I just want to talk about our source water for a moment. Many of you know that our water, we get our drinking water from Lake Erie. And one of my very favorite facts ever is that 20% of the entire world's accessible fresh water are found in the Great Lakes. Next slide. So Lake Erie is one of the largest sources of fresh water in the entire world. And Cleveland Water has a really nice intake system for how we get our drinking water. The 4 orange dots here in the picture are our 4 different water intakes, as we have 4 different water treatment plants. And the design of these take our water from as much as 40 feet deep and 20 feet off the bottom of the lake. So we're not taking surface water, which is where most plastics are found. Most plastics they float. So that's our first line of defense, is the way that our water comes to our plant, and just the fact that we have such a large source of water. Next slide. And microplastics, it's a new topic. There's not a lot of definitive data. There's no fast, commonly affordable, and reliable method of detection published yet. So it's not accessible. Research isn't really comparable to each other because there was no standardized method up until last month, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And there's no known human health implications as of now. Some active areas of research and concern would be chemicals that are out in the environment, like pharmaceuticals and pesticides. They're hydrophobic, so they'd rather be inside something like a plastic than out floating in water. So if chemicals absorb into plastics, and invertebrates, like Jill said in the beginning, they're eating plastic, and that's the very bottom of our food chain. These chemicals may be bioaccumulating up the food chain from ingestion of microplastics, and how would those chemicals maybe affect things like reproductive health. Also, an area of research is the physical damage that may be done to our organs by ingesting things like microplastics. Just
Shelly?
Sorry. By things like microplastics just scratching and causing inflammation to our organs if we're ingesting them ourselves. Also, something that is known is that microfibers have been discovered absolutely everywhere in the world, from deep sea to well water and rainwater, and they're airborne, so Arctic ice and soil, they're everywhere. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. Locally, oh, sorry, one back. Locally, there's somebody I'd like to highlight is Dr. Sherry Mason. She does a lot of microplastic research and research within the Great Lakes. Next slide. Two studies that you can look in, if you just Google her name, she's got a whole website and all of her articles are published there. So, but 2 studies that she looked at are studying bottled water and various tap water samples from around the world. And by comparing the data published in these studies, it was found that bottled water contained about twice as much microplastics than tap water. And if you think about it, bottles are made out of plastic, and if you open up the cap, maybe pieces of plastic can fall in from there. And then the other thing to highlight in these studies is that the smaller you look, the more you find. So microplastics just keep breaking down to smaller and smaller. So that's something in the methods that isn't really uniform. So if you're looking, just the more smaller you look, the more you find. Next slide. Something that was new to me when I started looking into this topic is that there's actually a lot of different types of plastic. This study looks at marine environments and what type of plastic is most abundant. So plastic bags, or the polyethylene, is by far the most common type of plastic in surface water in the marine environment. And just as you go down the line of these pictures is the abundance. 2 things that I'd like to point out. Nylon and polyester are very high abundance out in the marine environment, in the ocean, but those are the #1 in fresh water. So things like our wastewater from washing our polyester clothes. Our next presenter will actually touch on this topic a lot more. And then the last one I want to point out is right in the middle, the polyvinyl alcohol. I was kind of blown away to think that laundry detergent pods and dishwasher detergent pods, they break down and they hold what they're holding, and then they're designed to break down into microplastics. So that's also a significant source of microplastics in our environment. So just as consumers, something to be aware of. Next slide. My research specifically, I use fluorescent tagging and microscope quantification to research if I could find any plastics in our drinking water and in our raw water from the lake, and then I compared to bottled water as well. So I'll share with you some of my findings and how I was visually identifying, and then some of the issues and interferences with trying to do research without a standardized method. So next slide. These are examples of when I regularly look and monitor our algae in our raw water. And these pictures I took this year. So the very first picture, top left, is you can see about 3 different types of algae here, just to become familiar with what algae might look like under the microscope. And then the next 2 pictures, the top right and bottom left, have just a naturally occurring microfiber. Especially the bottom left, you can see it's blue. It doesn't have cellular structures or cell walls, really. I identify that as a microfiber. And then the last picture shows kind of a rainbow plastic shard in kind of the top middle. And these are unprocessed samples that I just get as I'm analyzing algae. So this sparked my interest to look into trying to identify microplastics and be able to quantify them. Next slide. And the method that I used was a lot of early research studies use this method. We used a micro sieve, which is just small screens of different sizes that will supposedly collect anything larger than the screen size. And then, so we filtered 12 liters of samples, which is a 24-pack of bottled water. And then we collected, we rinsed off these sieves and collected whatever we could from them, and used the Nile red stain, which is a fluorescent stain. It's supposed to absorb into the microplastics and then later fluoresce when exposed to a high frequency light. Next slide. And this is an example. I took this picture with the microscope, and you can see lots of different pieces of plastic fluorescing. But some issues that I had trying to quantify here, if you look into the bottom right corner here, there's a lot of very dim pieces. So I didn't know whether or not we should be counting these, and then different sizes. So there's no method to tell you exactly how big we should be counting. But you can see kind of that large piece looks like a fluorescent plastic, and that micro bead, the very spherical bright circle, those I would positively identify as plastics. Fibers poorly absorb the dye, so they don't really show up in this method. And then invertebrates also did absorb the dye. So if you go to the next slide, there was some guesswork to happen. These are examples of things that I would identify as a invertebrate, but they were also fluorescing and absorbing the dye. Next slide. So there were some issues at being able to quantify ourselves without a standard method, but Cleveland Water is aware of this potential issue of microplastics, and we have been investigating with our own research and what type of exposure we have. Something I want to highlight again is that our water intakes are designed really well that our water that comes to the plant is kind of a midsection of the lake, which would minimize the amount of plastics even making it to the water treatment plant. Also, microplastics are in an early stage of research. Just last month, on September 28th, California released a standard method, but this method uses a Raman spectroscopy and infrared spectroscopy, which are not very commonly affordable and require special advanced operations. And up until now, it's hard to compare data from different studies because there's no standardized method. The World Health Organization does have a statement saying that water suppliers and regulators should continue to prioritize removing microbial pathogens and chemicals from drinking water that are known to have significant risks to human health, because as of now, they do not consider microplastics a significant risk. Next slide. And I'd like to end with what can the public do? Just knowing what you buy, being aware first reduce the amount of plastic that you're buying and then reuse and recycle. There's a new thing out for laundry filters to reduce the amount of microplastics leaving your laundry, because most of our clothes are made of polyester and nylon, which are a major source of microplastics. So that's something new, and in the future we can start to expect that washer machines are going to have a filter built in, just like a dryer does. And then just making sure that if you see plastic in the environment, to clean it up. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. That was very interesting, and I really enjoyed the pictures under the microscope. I like seeing anything under a microscope, but it's really cool to compare what plastics look like compared to organic matter like algae or zooplankton. All right, moving on. We are going to hear from Steve Carbone. He is the Global Strategic Marketing Manager for Lubrizol Life Science. And I'm very excited about this presentation. I think this is going to be a lot of new information for me, someone who works in this all day. And I was excited to see that he does talk about laundry filters. So that was an excellent introduction, Shelley, to the laundry filters. So
yeah, thank you, Shelley, for the segue.
I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, Steve, and I'm going to get the presentation up right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about microplastics, about plastics and microplastics, and Tim and Shelley did a good job of giving us an intro about how detrimental discharge of plastics into the environment can be. And I'm going to talk about a very specific portion, root cause of that discharge, and that's the laundry process. And as Shelley just mentioned, that is a very, very large problem. So let's move forward to the next slide. I just want to give you a very quick overview of Lubrizol as a corporation. Lubrizol is about a $6 billion corporation with about 8,000 employees worldwide, a lot of them right here in the United States. And our headquarters is in the Cleveland area in Wickliffe, and Lubrizol Advanced Materials, the business for which I work, is headquartered in Brecksville. And that's where we have our laboratories for home care, beauty, and our other advanced materials. Next slide, please. I just wanted to make you aware, too, that Lubrizol has been making significant contributions and strides in improving our sustainability profile, not just from our manufacturing facilities, but also in the formulations that we develop, our technologies we develop. Performance at the customer and consumer level is always important, but all of that is done under the umbrella of providing sustainable solutions that are good for you, but also good for the environment. So that's my Lubrizol commercial. And now we're going to move on to the meat of the subject. So next slide, please. So sustainability is a key issue within the home care market and has been for the past several years. But to be frank, when I first started out in this business 30 some odd years ago, it was not an issue. There was one guy in a tie-dye shirt at a convention that was talking about sustainability, and now every company that supplies raw materials or finished goods in the home care market has a chief sustainability officer. So this goes to show you how important this topic has come, and rightly so. The three main issues that we're trying to address within the home care market right now are microplastics, water conservation, and energy conservation. Okay, so when we talk about microplastics, again, discharge of microplastics into the environment from the laundry process is a primary area. Conservation of water during manufacturing operations for laundry detergents and so forth, but also low water solutions for washing. Okay, that's where the largest amount of water utilization comes in, like from washing clothing and dishes and so forth. And of course, energy conservation. Cold water wash, for example, versus hot water wash. Next slide, please. Sustainability is also driving changes in fabrics. So as we go through this process of identifying, why microplastics from laundry is becoming more and more of an issue. If you look at the amount of water that's used to manufacture a given garment, okay, it dramatically changes as you move from, say, a cellulosic fiber like cotton, where you're looking at 2,700 liters of water that it takes to make a cotton shirt, compared to a polyester shirt that's about 400 liters of water. It's a significant step change in reduction in water utilization. It's a huge environmental benefit. It's, quite frankly, it's a cost advantage to the people that are manufacturing garments. Okay, and this is total embedded water. This goes from the harvesting and growing of cotton to processing, and it's the same thing with synthetic fibers. And as we move from synthetics, from natural fibers to synthetics, fast fashion is driving that as well. As we move to synthetics, they have different properties that we have to account for when we're doing laundry. As many of you know, if you wear performance athletic apparel like Under Armour or Nike Dry Fit, after a while, those garments tend to hold on to malodor quite tenaciously, and it takes a lot to get that locker room smell out of your garments. There's also the microfiber generation issue. There's a particular issue. So there's a lot of challenges. Sustainability is driving a lot of good things, but it also is creating some challenges for us in the laundry business. So move to the next slide, please. So, there's been a lot of discussion in the past two talks about, sources of marine microplastics, but you can see that about 35% of marine microplastics, and again, you can also extrapolate this out into freshwater as well, are coming from synthetic fibers. Okay, and synthetic fibers can be everything from garments that we wash in our laundry process to, synthetics that are coming from, again, fishing nets and things like that that are left in, that are lost and left in the ocean. So it's a big issue, and it's something that has to be addressed because, as Shelley was mentioning, these microplastics, they can interfere with food chains, with whether it be plankton, whether it be filter feeders like mollusks, clams, and things like that, or whatever. It's a big problem that we have to address. Next slide, please. So this has come, again, this has become a very big issue within the industry. Okay, we see articles in the Wall Street Journal. There's been a lot of peer-reviewed papers written about it. But again, microfiber pollution has become a huge issue within the garment industry, within the apparel industry. And, I go to many conferences that are about the apparel industry, about the textile industry. And branded apparel companies are very concerned about this. And there's a lot of organizations that you could see there under that second bullet point that are now heavily engaged in strategies to reduce this problem, to mitigate this problem. And you have a lot of companies like Patagonia and others, for example, that have already made statements about changing fabric design and things like that to help address this issue. So it's a really significant problem. And again, when the apparel companies are seeing this as an issue being driven by consumer awareness, it all trickles downhill, and then people like us that supply a myriad of technologies into the industry are being asked to help solve the problem. So next slide, please. So where's the problem coming from? Well, there's a lot of things that are going on in this process. There's a lot of moving parts. This is my one science slide here, so please bear with me. And this graph, which is courtesy of Mariela Zambrano from North Carolina State University, who did a very nice study on the impact of laundry conditions on the generation of microfibers. And basically, in a nutshell, what this slide is showing us is that whether you look at the utilization of detergent in the graph on the left, or you look at water temperature impact, the graph on the right, is you see that both of these conditions under which we launder our clothes have a significant impact on the amount of microfibers that are generated during the wash process. Okay, now these are laboratory conditions, but again, they're indicative of what can be done. Okay, what is happening and potential areas that we can address to help mitigate this process. Okay, and you can see it differs too by the different fiber sources, whether it be cotton, whether it be nylon, rayon, polycotton blends, and so forth. And you could even see it differs by the particle size of the fibers that are generated. Okay, but the main message here is that laundry conditions do matter and they do have an impact on the amount of microfibers that are released from the laundry process, regardless of fiber source. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So the big question is what can we do? Okay, and right now, okay, the main thing that we can do to help, mitigate this problem is a couple of things. One, we can try to help reduce the generation of microfibers in the first place. And I'll be completely frank with the audience, is that these bullet points that I have here are just based on anecdotal information, based on some of the mechanisms that we've seen suggested for how microfibers are generated during laundry. So we've seen that there's a negative impact by using hot water, so you can launder in cold water. There's also the impact of agitation, okay, because you do have a lot of fiber-fiber interaction, just like when you have pilling of a sweater, when you wash it in a washing machine, you don't hand wash. That helps create these microfibers that eventually break off from the garment and get discharged out of the machine. So you can use delicate or permanent press cycles that are typically more gentle and they have lower spin cycle speeds that can treat the fabrics a little bit more gently. Okay. And the third thing you can look at is trying to find milder detergents. Okay, there is a really good indication that the addition of detergents makes microfiber generation a little bit worse, and by treating the fibers more gently with a gentle detergent, something like a Hoellein, or I know Dreft was an old detergent we used to use to wash baby clothes, that are typically milder than some of your other detergents, may give some benefit. There's also the opportunity to use 2-in-1 conditioning detergents that have a little bit of fabric softener built into them that may, again, there's I don't have statistically meaningful data to show this, but that may, during the wash cycle, add a little bit of lubrication and mitigate that fiber-fiber interaction to a certain degree. And the same thing with fabric softeners in the rinse cycle. Again, where there's a lot of agitation, the fabric softeners are typically, waxy compounds, fatty compounds that act as lubricants. And that's what gives you the softening benefit. And when they deposit on the fabric, maybe that can help mitigate the microfiber generation as well. So you're protecting the fabric a little bit. And the other thing we can do is we can, mechanically remove the microfibers that are in the wash water before it gets discharged. And you could do that in a couple of ways. There's a product out there in the market now called the Carbone, and you can see it there in the bottom left. And you simply toss this device. It's a high surface area device. They call it a Carbone because it looks like a piece of coral, and that mechanically captures microfibers and lint. And then you pull that out and you clean it after you're done, and you throw it back in, and it's a non-chemical type of thing. And you do that in the wash. The other thing you can do, again, is there's many inline filters that you can attach to the discharge hose of your washing machine, and that will will remove certain small particles before they get discharged as well. Again, you have to clean that as well, and you have to clean it very frequently so you're not backing things up in your washing machine and damaging the internals. But mechanical filtration is a great way to go right now to help. That's something we can all do now to help mitigate this problem. And if we move on to the next slide, if we look at the problem from a broader perspective, what can we really do going forward? And you know, at Lubrizol, we have chemistry, we have technology that actually is applied in the manufacturing of fibers. We make a lot of elastomeric fiber that goes into things like Lululemon and Athleta, you know, yoga pants and things like that. But we also make fiber finishing, coatings that go onto fiber, and we also have technology. My business is how do we care for fibers? So it's going to be an integrated approach between dealing with building better, more robust, more durable fibers, maybe have special treatments to protect those fibers long term, make them last longer, to keep them from defibrillating and discharging these things into the wastewater, and building better detergents to be more gentle on fiber, and also collaborating with washing machine manufacturers, okay, who are looking for new technologies to find lower water, lower agitation ways to keep our clothes clean. So again, that's what Lubrizol is doing now. We're trying to leverage all these internal technologies, whether it's our polymer chemistry, our applications and testing capabilities, and our relationships with fabric manufacturers and branded apparel manufacturers to help us develop better solutions that can help make better fabrics that aren't going to be as detrimental to the environment. So there's no easy solution. It's going to take a lot of people working together in conjunction with, you know, universities and so forth, who are doing a lot of work. I know a lot of the detergent companies are very actively pursuing formulations to address this issue as part of their sustainability initiatives. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It may be a longer tunnel than we want, but there's a lot of work and a lot of energy being applied here. And that, I think that's okay. I do have a summary slide. So again, the microplastics issue is a problem. It's not an unrecognized problem anymore. I think that's the great message here within our industry. So within the apparel industry and the laundry care industry, it is a well understood problem. And you know, again, we understand that these are a key component, and it will be a multifaceted approach to a long-term and more permanent solution to microplastic discharge into the marine and freshwater environments. So again, I thank you for your time, and any questions, be more than happy to entertain them. If you'd like to reach out to me offline, I think my contact information will be available at the end of the session.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. That was great. I'm really excited when we get to hear from the private industry, because I know they are doing a lot. I just like to hear about what's being done. And so if anyone has questions, those can be placed in the chat. And while we wait for questions to come in, I do just want to thank everyone for being here. I want to say thank you to Kathy for putting together this wonderful group of presenters. We heard from academia, we heard from the public sector, we heard from the private sector, and I think it just gave us a really nice overview of plastics in our water and what is being done to prevent the problem and mitigate the problem. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll through the chat and see if we have any questions. All right, so I've come across a question, and I'm not sure who the most appropriate panelist is to address this. So if you want to unmute yourself and put your video back on. This question is from Ariel, and it is there a breakdown on fishing nets versus clothing textiles as a percentage of the total? So I don't know if anyone has that information.
I do not. I do not have information about that. I know that there's a lot of data that's no pun intended, floating around out there. But there is a fair amount of microplastics that are coming from fabrics from garments. I don't know what the split is on that, Tim. I don't know if you have any more information on that than I, but I don't have a definitive number.
Yeah, in the Great Lakes, we don't find a lot of fishing litter, generally speaking. So in the Great Lakes, it's probably not much of a proportion compared to airborne microplastics and plastics in our wastewater, and which is textiles. In the oceans, there is a greater proportion of fishing litter that's found as macroplastic, and I would imagine probably that bleeds into microplastic. But it's challenging when you find a small piece of microplastic thread. If it's made of nylon, it's hard to know if that came from a fishing net or if that came from clothing. So sourcing becomes more difficult at that small size.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that information. All right, we have another question. This is from David, and it is talking about the plastic consuming bacteria that I'm sure many of us are aware of. But he would just like to know, what is the feasibility, pros and cons of using these newly discovered plastic consuming bacteria?
I think that would be best answered by somebody in wastewater. There are, as a step to wastewater, there's a bacteria step that decomposes a lot of things. So I'm not sure about introducing that specific bacteria into the wastewater treatment plant, but I think that would be the area that this would be applied. That's helpful at all.
Yeah, I can say that there's natural enzymes that have evolved in bacteria to break down oil, hydrocarbons in wax, and that these can break down some microplastics or some plastics, but it's very slow and requires a lot of energy. This is not a great food source. So I think the idea is that by discovering these natural enzymes, they can be kind of scaled up into a processing step that might be more artificial, but based on this discovery from bacteria. So from my understanding, that's the pathway that's most promising.
Thank you. And yes, it's newer research. I still think more research needs to be done because, as always, when we introduce any type of organism or bacteria to manage something, we want to make sure it's not going to cause some negative consequence further down the road.
Yeah.
So this question has been directed towards Tim, and it's talking about nurdles. So for those of you, nurdles, those are the perfectly circular plastics they're plastic in its virgin form. They are also called pre-production pellets. Shelley showed a picture of hers under the microscope. It was the perfectly circular piece of plastic. So the question is, are you finding these raw plastic pellets in the surveys of Chicago's waterways as well? Do any of our presenters have advice on what affected communities can do to stop these nurdles from entering our waterways? And just to give you some background, presenters, yes, we do find these in Ohio a lot. And so just interest if they're being found elsewhere and what we can do to prevent them.
Yes, well, the answer is we find them in the Chicago River for sure. And we find them on our beaches, and they're found on beaches all over the Great Lakes. They look like kind of small little discs. They're often white, but they can be different colors. And they're really abundant. Once you start seeing them, you'll start seeing more. People have, there's no, they're essentially from the plastic manufacturing industry. They're lost from manufacturers in transport or at the industry itself. There's been a whole series of kind of citizen activism that's gone on in Louisiana and Texas coast lines, where citizens have traced these back to some specific manufacturers. But right now, there's no, plastic is not treated as a regulated pollutant. So there's no law other than littering, I suppose, about how much plastic or nurdles can be out there. But there's interest in perhaps coming up with regulatory solutions or otherwise to try to reduce this point source.
Yeah, I can say that Lubrizol, we produce a lot of resin, okay, and we are participants. Our manufacturing facilities are all participants in a project called Operation Clean Sweep, And what we do within all of our facilities is we have remediation methodologies in place to make sure that anything that as raw materials are offloaded into our plant and moved around our plant, things like that, that spills are contained. For example, all the floor drains and things like that have mesh baskets in them of a proper mesh size to prevent particulates of the same size as these resin beads and things like that from falling into the storm drains and getting washed out into the environment. And we actively participate in that. There's also other organizations that's more of a self-regulated thing that we've committed to, but there's also other industry organizations that we work with to make sure that we minimize the impact of these raw material incidents. Okay, we have very few of them, but when we do, we try to make sure that none of them get released out into the environment.
Excellent. Thank you for that information. And I can touch base a little bit about it as well. Here for us in Ohio, yes, plastics are not a regulated pollutant, but if you suspect an industry is polluting them, you can report them to the local county health district as well as the state EPA, and they will take action. We are good to end our session. Again, I want to say thank you to Kathy for organizing this session. I want to say thank you to our 3 presenters. That was wonderful information. And I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope you learned some great information.